Hey everyone, last week we ran a session with our good friends at MURAL, along with others joining us from American Express, Prudential, Macmillan, Pearson, all these really great companies. What we were trying to figure out and learn together and sort of prove to ourselves and the rest of the world is that you don't need to be in the same room in order to get great work done together. So we ran a remote design sprint. In this week's video, I'm going to share what we've learned and hopefully give that back to you so you can try it on your own. And then we'd love to hear from you so that we can incorporate whatever you learn into our next sessions and keep it going. Okay, so before we get into it, the reason that I was personally so motivated to do this session was I think we've all seen this rise in virtual workforces. People working from different offices, different parts of the world, different time zones, and doing things collaboratively together. But for some reason, when it comes to things like these design thinking workshops or design sprints or anything like that, there's been a real struggle to figure it out. I mean, we personally struggled at New Haircut for years because we knew that doing things in person and collaboratively like that, elbow to elbow with people in the room, it's really hard to replace that sort of dynamic that happens between people when you're in that shared space together. But we wanted to figure it out. We wanted to take a step in that direction. I mean, I've got 2 little boys at home and I would like to not miss their entire childhoods. So I have a personal interest in figuring this thing out, spending less time in airports and on planes and traveling all over the world. So that was my personal motivation to do this session together, and when Jim Kalbach and I started talking about this, I jumped at it. Okay, so I learned a whole bunch during this session, but let me share with you my top 5. And number 1 won't surprise any of you, it's to prepare. So if you followed along with any of the other content we've shared about problem framing and research and in general, what happens before a design sprint, you'll know how strongly we feel about this notion that you can just walk into the room on Monday of sprint week and everything just magically lines up and takes care of itself. That's not the case. Probably 10 times more so when you're doing these things remotely. You really have to over-prepare. So to do that, Jim and I made sure that everything was set up in advance. So again, we use MURAL to guide this session, and Jim and I set up the workspaces so that everything was there when the participants joined this session. We had all of the exercises that we wanted them to get through. We had instructions for each exercise. We had different reminders and tools that we worked into it so that they could stay on track. We color-coded things. It was really as set up as possible so that the tool itself didn't get in the way. Okay, and big takeaway number 2 really kind of builds on this last topic that we were talking about, which was the pre-work that we gave the people that joined our session. And that's sort of this bigger idea of what can be done synchronously versus asynchronously. I mean, listen, when you're doing these things, imagine sitting there with your camera on you and 8 other people on this call together, and you're sitting there sketching for 2 hours. It just kind of seems silly. So certain things make sense, right? If you're doing your goals and questions and it's 10, 15 minutes of individual work and then you're getting back together and sharing and converging, makes total sense to stay on your call. But other things where you have to diverge and do some work or do some additional research, figure out a way that you work that into your schedule so that becomes offline time and you're not just sitting on the call together. So big takeaway number 3 then was to use tools that you're familiar with. This is important and a lesson that we follow for in-person sprints, but it's even more important when you're doing things virtually, where technology has this tendency to get in the way and you just can't let it because then people kind of just check out. So the couple tools that we used with really great success during this session was, you've heard me talk about MURAL, and not everyone joining our session had ever used MURAL. So in advance, we gave them a little bit of pre-work to do, like I mentioned earlier. And then during the session, we had some warm-up exercises where they got to create a couple virtual stickies. So, and that's kind of a subtle point within there, is to make sure people are familiar with the tools once they get into them and do some warm-up exercises so that the tool doesn't get in the way. The other tool that we used for video conferencing was Zoom. We've also used this for a number of years at New Haircut. It's a great tool. I even learned a new feature during this session, which is where you can create breakout rooms, which is really powerful. You can separate groups or teams into separate Zoom rooms so that they're not overpowering each other and kind of talking over each other. Really cool. Big takeaway number 4, don't try to do your first sprints remotely like this, or really any kind of design thinking session. There's just too much nuance in terms of process, how people are going to be working together, the things that you'll share, the ideas that go back and forth. It's much better if you do these first few in person together, get familiar with the process, figure out who can facilitate well, where the pitfalls are, the things that you need to prepare in advance, and then start to take pieces of the sprint and do them virtually. So the first things that we did virtually were journey maps and experience maps. Those work really well for using tools like MURAL and doing things remotely. And then just add and layer on more and more pieces of the process until you feel really confident that you can run most of or an entire sprint in this remote fashion. And finally, big takeaway number 5 is there's this thing I've always believed about things like design sprints where the best ideas come from the quietest people. So the thing is, when you're in person, it's hard for quiet people to hide. You're all in the room together. But in a virtual session, people can keep more quiet. And so there's this facilitator that exists in in-person sprints, and that's still important for remote sessions, but even more so, you need everyone to almost mini facilitate in a way. So there's this really cool trick that Jim shared with me that we use during the session. When you're going through things and it's this individual share, ask the person that's sharing to nominate and call out the next person that they want to share. It's pretty cool because then everyone gets a chance to facilitate in a little bit of way, and it creates this connection between people, and it really keeps the discussion moving forward. So that's it, my big 5 takeaways from this first session we did with MURAL. It's the first of many that we're gonna do together with them. There's still a lot to learn and cover. We didn't cover parts of the sprint like prototyping and interviewing. We wanna get into that next. There's also problem framing and research and road mapping, all things that we know can be done in person, but we really want to try to figure out how to do more of it remotely. So stick around and keep a lookout for those upcoming events. You can sign up for them. I hope that these things were helpful for you and an upcoming sprint that you're trying to plan remotely. Please do share what you learned, because we would love to take that into our next sessions and then share back with the community. Good luck and keep us posted on your progress.